But you're right. With COVID, it really does lead to a whole nother level of intimacy. As you said, you can see my dog, you can see my cool New England home. But I think there's still an opportunity for, as an employee, to kind of retain some privacy and say, like, I'm not comfortable sharing pieces of myself with you. And I can usually tell if they have a Zoom background on. Like, if they have a background, I usually assume that there's only so much. Like, that's almost like a wall that they're putting up where they don't want me to necessarily see into their personal life. And I try to be very respectful of that.
Welcome to How I Made It in Marketing from Marketing Sherpa. We scour pitches from hundreds of creative leaders and uncover specific examples. Not just trending ideas or buzzword-laden schmaltz. Real-world examples to help you transform yourself as a marketer. Now, here's your host, the Senior Director of Content and Marketing at Marketing Sherpa, Daniel Burstein, to tell you about today's guest.
Go into the meeting with a high-level story. This is the lesson our next guest learned from one of her former leaders. When I read this lesson in her podcast guest application, I thought it was a good lesson. But then, here's when it got really good. I saw who she learned it from. He was a CDO, Chief Data Officer. Now, our biases may say, a data person? Oh boy, this presentation is going to get down into the weeds. It's going to be chock full of numbers and spreadsheets that are confusing at best, or even worse, it's going to look important, but it doesn't really help the organization make decisions. So if that CDO can go into meetings with a high-level story, so can I, and so can you, to sell your marketing ideas internally, to get budget, to advocate for the customer. And stories, that's the stock and trade of the How I Made It in Marketing podcast. If you've listened before, it is how we hope to grab you, add a little interest or fun to your day, and most importantly, pass along the lessons from the marketing leaders and entrepreneurs we talk to help inspire your next great campaign or your career move. Like our next guest, who will share the story behind how she learned that lesson from the Chief Data Officer, along with many other lesson-filled stories from her career. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Emily Campbell, the Chief Marketing Officer of Infinite Electronics. Thanks for joining us, Emily.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
So let's take a quick look at your background. I just kind of cherry-picked off your LinkedIn. Earlier in your career, you started as marketing manager at Compaq. Then you were at Dell for many years. You rose to Vice President of Global Online Product Management at Dell. You were a Senior Director of E-Business at National Instruments. You've had many other roles, but right now, for the past year, you've been the Chief Marketing Officer at Infinite Electronics. For those who don't know, Infinite Electronics is a Warburg Pincus portfolio company. Warburg Pincus is a global private equity firm with $85 billion in assets under management. And Emily manages a $30 million marketing budget and a team of 40 people. So Emily, give us an idea. What is your day like as Chief Marketing Officer?
Well, most days are pretty diverse. We have a number of different marketing campaigns that are running at any given time. Infinite is kind of a portfolio company within Warburg Pincus as our private equity sponsor. We actually go to market under a number of different brand names. So we have brands that are in various stages of growth, some that are much smaller, some that are larger. And so really trying to make sure that we're addressing customer needs across a broad range of market categories is really critical. And then we also have a number of strategic programs that we're working on, including a massive digital transformation program, which includes new websites for each of the brands that we host or that we own, and also looking at a new product information management tool, a new how we align our customer data. So just a lot of major changes in the corporation right now.
And that's great. And we're going to get into some of those stories with Emily, especially how she's communicating some of that with her board of directors. So if you're struggling with that, I think you could learn a lot from Emily. But I also want to call on one thing too we were talking about. I know some B2B organizations, very sales driven, sales just going out there, getting whatever leads they can get. But the way I look at it is you have a well-fed sales team. So you want to tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Infinite is very marketing driven. So if you think about like the pointy end of the spear, we spend a lot of time looking at how we're driving online revenue, but also how we're ultimately driving leads into the sales organization. And the majority of our customers are coming to the business from leads generated from the web. We have a very tight relationship with our sales organization. Actually, one of the best I've ever seen in any companies that I've worked with. I meet with the sales organization almost daily. The sales lead also meets with the marketing team quite frequently, and it's just a very positive, activities float all boats. We're all trying to achieve the same thing, and we don't have conflicting goals, which is amazing and makes it so much easier when we're working together. But yeah, we do love the fact that a lot of the activities that we're doing from a marketing perspective are what really drive the revenue for the company.
Okay, great. Well, let's look at some of the lessons we can learn from the things you made in marketing. So I've never worked in another career, but I kind of feel like as marketers, other than like a podiatrist or actuary, we make things. We get to make things. We make campaigns, we make brands. And one of the things you made was Dell.com, actually redesigning Dell.com. And the lesson you learned from that was to balance the art and science of marketing. So we've heard this before, but I want to get into the specific story of how you did it because it's really interesting. So can you share that with us, Emily?
Yeah, absolutely. So Dell.com is in a constant state of flux and always evolving. But I was involved in the online business at Dell for many years while I was there. But one project in particular really stood out to me. We were working on revamping the purchase experience for our consumer business. And it was very contentious. We wanted to really bring together on a global basis the purchase path so that we didn't have each region or even country operating with a completely different path and making it very difficult to manage on a global basis. So we did a ton of research up front, and then we designed new pages, launched a new purchase path. And, one of the things we found is no matter how well you think you've planned up front, there are things that you will not learn until something actually goes live. And then, it's chaos, right? So we took an approach that basically said, we have KPIs that we've established up front, and we have success metrics that we've defined that say, once we get to this level, we believe that we are confident that we will be in the right place to deploy this website on a global basis. And we did a number of A/B tests, actually a ton of them, in order to pre-test activities or things that we wanted to add into the website when we launched the new purchase path. But also, once we deployed, we did a number of tests to make some enhancements to the site as we went, and then continue to do testing as we went through the deployment and on an ongoing basis. And we were able to very clearly see revenue enhancements and conversion enhancements based on the testing that we were doing. I know a lot of companies do A/B tests, and a lot of companies talk about testing and how they're using it. But at Dell, that was like core and fundamental to the work that we were doing with the online group. We were doing hundreds of tests a quarter, and very, very focused on making sure that we were improving the customer experience and ultimately driving revenue growth for the company.
All right, so I know sometimes with a homepage or a website, especially with a company as big as Dell, it could be a bit of a political turf battle, right? Everybody wants to get on the homepage. Everyone wants to get their product on the homepage or service on the homepage or get, in the nav or where it wants to be. By doing all that testing, did you help have like some information where you could push back and say, hey, maybe, that shouldn't be at the top of the homepage or it shouldn't be in the nav or something like that? Did any of that data really help you make a decision of what should be there versus what can happen in, some organizations where it's more of a political battle of who gets to be where?
Absolutely. And I think that was very continuously happening all throughout this program where we were doing these tests. And this is why it's a bit of the art and science, right? It's like you want to have data to inform your decisions. It can't be just, hey, an executive swoops in and says, I don't like that color, or I don't like that placement, or, you have different stakeholders who want, as you said, like better positioning on the homepage or in the header. You really want to have the data to back up what you're doing. And that's where a lot of this testing and having predefined KPIs, things along those lines really came into play. But you also have to think strategically about, okay, now what do I do with all this data? And that's where a lot of the art comes in. So I know what I know, but I don't know what is going to work the best as my next step. So really being able to balance out I'm taking in a lot of information, but I'm coming out with a few activities or actions that really make sense based on all of this information. And by continually testing and testing in small increments, we were able to really alleviate a lot of that executive swoop in where we could actually show them with data what worked best.
Yeah, that's great. Also, wonder, you talk about the art and science. I wonder, what about the philosophy of marketing? And here's what I mean. So, for example, we have a free digital marketing course. It's called Become a Marketer Philosopher. And so if you can think of, the creative is commonly referred to as art, and the science is studying customer behavior, like with testing. But philosophy gets to the more fundamental. Like when you said, we're going to design Dell.com based on customer behavior versus executive approval. Like saying we're going to design based on customer behavior with the testing versus executive approval. That's fundamental, right? That's not art or science. That is an internal philosophy. That's a philosophy you've kind of, you're trying to bring into the organization or, keep going in the organization. So do you have any thoughts in general on that philosophy of marketing, like how to actually approach it?
Oh, good question. I mean, I think that when you're trying to determine like what your overall framework is, and I would think about that almost as the framework that then you're operating within, you have to have some guidelines to say, I believe that this is true. Like, I believe that we can get more revenue from our online site if we do this correctly, or I believe that we can increase average order value, or whatever the goal is, increase NPS. You almost have to build that framework that defines the philosophy before you even get started. If you don't have that, you're not grounded in what success looks like. And so I think that it's really important. I look at it right now. We're working on developing a philosophy at my current company with what do we want to do with customer data? How do we want to define what is a customer? And, particularly in a B2B based business where you have users and you have buyers and you have approvers and you have, different bill to and ship to addresses. And it can get super complex when you start thinking about what is a customer. I think if you don't have that philosophy fully grounded and vetted before you start doing a data cleansing program or aligning against a new CDP, you just get lost in the data over time, and you can't kind of come up with the final answer if you don't have that philosophy fully documented before you go into the process.
That's great. And speaking of a B2B company, I often see that when it comes to leads or leads generated, it's like, well, what is a lead? Is a lead like, well, we bought an email address from somewhere and now that's a lead. Oh, look at all these leads we got. Or is the lead, this is the person that has raised their hand, that has indicated interest, that has met whatever, revenue benchmarks they have to have or decision-making benchmarks. And so, yeah, exactly. That philosophy, that framework is so important because without it, frankly, too, we can say success is whatever we want to say it is. We've gotten all these leads versus, hey, we actually had this goal going in. We have this goal going in because we know it's what's going to be profitable to the company or make us successful. And then this is how we're kind of using art and science to achieve that goal.
Yes.
I love that. All right, let's talk about something. Go on.
Oh, I was going to say,
go on.
With my team, they will often say, well, I don't really have a goal because I don't know what's going to happen. And I'm like, put a goal in place. Even if you're wrong, and you undoubtedly will be, at least you have a guidepost. It's like if you get a 5% increase in whatever you're looking for, is that enough? Is that not enough? Start with a goal and then, measure around that as you keep going and get more intelligent as you put, whether it's capabilities or campaigns in place. You're going to learn a lot as you're going. But if you don't at least have a target to start with, then you're just, again, you never know if you did enough or if you were successful.
Right. And that actually goes along with testing very well, because testing, the way business borrowed that from science, right? And science believes in hypothesis-based testing. What you're actually testing is a hypothesis. You have a hypothesis set up beforehand, and you're either proving or disproving the hypothesis. And I worked with a data scientist, a PhD, who explained it to me this way, which I thought was very clear. And he's like, it's looking at a forest and throwing a rock and hitting a tree and saying, hey, I hit that tree, versus looking at a forest and before you throw the rock saying, my goal is to hit that tree, and then you see if you hit it or not.
Right,
That always
exactly.
resonated with me. I was like, that's very clear. Yeah. Now let's talk about one of your next lessons. You say get out of your comfort zone. So I think this is really it's a career lesson, but it's also a life lesson. So how did you have to get out of your comfort zone in your career, Emily?
Yeah. So I had been at Dell for about 3 years, and one of my bosses moved to Europe, and basically gave me an opportunity to move to Europe, take over marketing for desktop marketing in Europe, and was like, you can come to Ireland, you can do, really expand your career, do a lot more, it'll be great. And in my experience, in my life, I was not that young, but honestly, I hadn't had a lot of experience internationally. It was something that I really aspired to in my career. Personally, I think Ireland is a little bit like expat light. Everybody speaks English, so it's not as difficult as moving like to China or something like that. But it really was, for me personally, very much outside my comfort zone. I had 2 young children. And we basically packed up and moved as what we called at Dell a local hire. So that meant I didn't have the safety net of an expat package. I sold my house in Texas and I moved to Ireland with my family, with a 4 and a 2-year-old. I
Wow.
don't think you have to be quite that dramatic to get out of your comfort zone. It certainly worked for me in terms of things that I learned and experiences that I had. But I would just say it's an important lesson for everyone to say, like, what are those things that really can push you to learn new things, can help you think about things in a brand new way. And yeah, I would encourage anybody who has an opportunity to move overseas and work internationally. It's been over 10 years since I came back, and I still think about that continually as a learning experience, and something that I lean on now when I'm working in Asia or Latin America or Europe. I feel like I learned enough when I was there to really give me a leg up when I'm working with other cultures. But it was difficult, and it was a personal challenge that I took on that, I am incredibly grateful for, and I loved doing it. I was supposed to be there for 18 months. I ended up being there for almost 5 years.
So, what is the biggest thing you learned from doing that, from going to Ireland, from living there? Because when you did that, you didn't just work there, you lived there, right? You were in that culture. I think, when I started in working internationally, I got to work with, some big software companies, and they had international teams. And, earlier in my career, I was very American focused. And, I'm a writer, so I was worried about language. And, I was always told, well, the great thing is English is the international business of language. And America, it's kind of the capital of commerce. So whoever you're working with around the world, it's very America focused and America centric. But the good teams I worked with, they were able to say, well, we can use English in this country, but, and they understood different cultural aspects of a country to be able to, change things or shape things. But I hadn't had that experience at that point of, actually living and working overseas. So having actually gone there, lived in Ireland, you're physically there, you're not just kind of what we're doing now, just, digitally, working with the team remotely. What did you learn? Like, what was your biggest takeaway?
I would, this is maybe a little bit cliche, but I would say there's an 80-20 to everything that you're doing internationally. And that has actually been almost a foundational element that I've carried forward. The 80% that's the same, regardless of the company or the culture that you're working with, people have the same motivations personally. Business needs are very similar across the board. And then there's this 20% that sits on top of that is very special by culture, by country, by language. And you have to, first of all, think about what is the 80% and then what is that 20%? And one of the things that I found is when I went into European marketing, every country was managing their own separate business. And we quickly moved to a pan-European model. And it was like they were all starting from scratch. Well, we were able to take massive costs out and still customize all of our messages, all of our pricing, all of the products by creating some foundational templates that were used across Europe. by really building up some of this baseline, that 80% that can be the same, and then really customizing it in the last bit. And in that customization, really focusing on what are the important things for that country, that culture, and competition in that area, things along those lines. But you don't have to start from scratch in every single place that you are. And I'm taking that lesson even now. As I mentioned, Infinite has a number of different brands that we go to market under different brand names. And as we're doing this digital transformation, we're really taking that 80-20 approach where we want the websites to be 80% the same so that they're easier to manage. Ultimately, tests that we do in one brand, we can apply in other brands easily. But we know that there's a need based on different markets, based on different customer types, et cetera, that 20% needs to be really thoughtful and well thought out in order to be successful. So I would say, again, like I say, it's a little cliche with the 80-20 rule, but I think that really does apply to so many different things that you're working on. And certainly it's something that I learned in Europe. It's not like every country is completely different. There are a lot of similarities, but the differences are important.
And that sounds like a nice balance between the overall corporate brand or the overall regional brand and what's needed locally. So we're talking internationally. Let's get a little closer to home, okay? The people you work with directly. You said first team first. That's another one of your lessons. What does that mean in terms of collaborating with your team? First team first.
Yeah. So this is something that is, my boss in my current company, the CEO of Infinite, has really taken to heart, and it's conceptually saying your peer group is your first team. So my work that I do with the CRO, with the CIO, with the CFO, that is my first team. That is my priority, and that is the group of people that I am most closely working with and most aligned with. And I think, as kind of being the marketeer in the group and one of the only females in the group, I think you almost feel the need to kind of protect your team, or you might feel the need to, help your team grow. And that's important as well. But really focusing on this first team as your peer group. One of the things that I've learned there is your life is so much easier if you and your peer group are aligned on your core objectives, that you're working together to achieve your targets and goals, and that you're not setting yourselves up as competitors, but actually as teammates. I encourage the exact same thing with my team members, and making sure that they know that supporting each other is just as important or more important than supporting their teams. And again, it's a little bit of a different philosophy, but I've worked a number of times in organizations where that wasn't the case, and where the executive team was not aligned and not working together as a team, and they were actually creating conflicting goals amongst their teams, and in some cases doing it on purpose because they felt like it drove a better end result. I can tell you that it's just so much more pleasant to work in an environment where the executive team is aligned. But as an executive team member, it just makes everything so much easier. And I feel like we spend a lot of time getting that alignment and making sure that we're all on the same page. But when we leave the room, we're all together and working together.
Yeah, one of those groups where like the knives are out, right? Like, so we talked about the website where sometimes the knives are out and there's some political battle who's on the website. Boy, when it comes to budget time, that's when those knives can really be out, right? Who gets to carve a piece out of the budget? So you talked about, the organization's currently in the middle of a large digital transformation. I would imagine teaming up with a CIO or CTO role is crucial for that, but also just the entire organization being aligned around that, because that affects a lot of things budget-wise and just how the organization operates. So is there any specific advice you have to others going through a similar digital transformation, how to work with, their team on the executive board, how to make sure that goes down to everyone's team and understand what role they play in that transformation? Because, just one example, if a CRM is involved, if marketing and the CTO and the CIO are all into creating the CRM and sales isn't aligned, we can have this beautiful CRM that doesn't have anything in it. So what's your advice on going through a large digital transformation, Emily?
Yeah, I mean, I think exactly what you said. It's like you have to make sure that all of the pieces of the pie actually understand their roles and understand where you're coming from and what you're trying to accomplish. So, for example, I'm the executive sponsor of the digital transformation program because I own e-commerce for the business, and that makes sense. But one of the things that we found is we're implementing a new product information management tool at the same time. And there is a huge amount of work to actually transition our existing product data into a new taxonomy. We're doing a lot of data cleansing and enhancement on our product data, and it would be absolutely impossible for me to do that work or anyone on the marketing team. We need the product management team to be very, very involved in a cleanup effort, which maybe that's not their top priority. They're really looking at the future product roadmap, not so much looking at what they've launched in the past. But as the company has evolved and the one of the brands that we go to market under has been around for 50 years. So, as the markets have evolved, expectations have increased, and the amount of product information you need to have on your website and through your channel partners has significantly changed over the past 50 years. So, I don't think we sell any products that are 50 years old, but we might. But it really is like, how do you go back and fix stuff? You need to have the product management team engaged and aligned around that goal and really setting the priorities up front. I worked with the leader of that team last year to make it part of their goals and objectives this year, that's one of their core priorities, is to do this data cleanup initiative around the PIM. So it may seem like they aren't core to a digital transformation, but as it's turning out, they're incredibly critical. And I'm very glad that I did the alignment up front to make sure that they were on the same page.
Yeah, I used to work in the software business, and I would joke, software is magic, right? Because sometimes it was sold as so much like, company has problem A, they buy the software, everything's great, they get these great results. But in reality, software only does so much. It's the people that actually do that work. And so when you talk about something like taxonomy, I think that framework and that philosophy you talked about earlier is really just crucially important, to get that taxonomy right. You got to get everyone on that right page and understand why they're doing it. So another lesson you had, challenge your team and help them grow. So earlier we talked about how you got challenged by your boss's boss's boss who ended up in Ireland, transformational for your career. How have you, as a leader now, learned how to challenge your team and help them grow?
Yeah. So, I was thinking about this question, and I was thinking back throughout my career, and even in my current job, I'm really focused around doing individual performance development plans so that people can actually start thinking about where they want to be in the future, what they want to do. But I found that with your team, everyone on your team is slightly different in terms of how they want to be managed, what they will be successful at, what they'll volunteer to do versus what you have to kind of push them a little to do. And I was thinking back to a specific person on my team, many years ago, who I think that the general commentary around this person was that he was lazy, super smart guy, very well organized, always came with the right information, but never really went above and beyond in any way. And it was kind of like, yeah, he's good, but is he ever going to be a senior leader in the organization? Is he ever going to be a vice president? Probably not. And I looked at him and said, this guy is bored. So my goal was to just give him more and more and more and more work, and just see if I could challenge him and kind of get him to the point where he says, okay, I'm done. You can't give me anything else to do. And it took a long time before we got there. So by the time, within a year after he started working for me, I think he was accomplishing and doing 5 times more than he had been when I started in that role. And he was much happier and more motivated. And the thing about this story that I love is my boss, who had said, this guy is lazy, you'll have to evaluate whether or not you even want to keep him on the team. She later hired him as her VP of sales at another company that she went to. So, I think that not only were we able to actually challenge him and get a lot out of this person, but ultimately, the role that he ended up with was working for someone who had been questioning whether or not we even wanted him at the company a few years before.
I love that lesson, and here's why, because we've talked about personal branding a lot on the How I Made It Marketing podcast, and mostly when it comes to personal branding, it's about, us branding ourselves and our career. But the flip side of personal branding is, as leaders, a brand is, in a way, a prejudgment of someone, right? You're prejudging a company when you think of their brand. You have different associations with them, and you can prejudge a person too. So what I really like what you did there is you didn't just kind of look at that individual's personal brand, which in that case was not necessarily a positive. You kind of dug deeper and tried to see, like, what are their motivations? How can you place them correctly on their team? Which we as leaders have to do. We've got these different people to work with. How can we place them correctly in our team? And you found a way to really turn that. You probably helped turn around that person's career and made them a lot more productive. And that's a fantastic thing we can do as managers, as leaders, is not just, try to do things like digital transformations with software, but actually look at the people and how can we transform their personal lives and their careers. But let's get back to that digital transformation again, because this lesson, I think, ties very nicely into it. Another lesson you said, it's hard to be simple. And so you talk about that digital transformation. How are you communicating that to your current board of directors? Because we talked about, with your team, with your peers, getting everyone aligned. So you've kind of got those two levels, essentially the people that report to you, the people that are your peers, but getting that board of directors on board for something that is, the clear part of it is probably is the cost, right? But the thing that's a little more hazy is, what is the value of it? So how do you get them on board?
Yeah. So I think I put in my application something that Coco Chanel said at one point, which is, before you leave your house in the morning, look, turn away and then turn back around and look at the mirror. And the first thing that you see, take it off. Jewelry wise, not your clothes, obviously, but scarves, things along those lines. You tend to over accessorize, and it's really good to be simple. And, I kind of take that approach in my board decks. It's like, I'll put in everything that I think we need, and then I start taking stuff out. So it's like, okay, can I tell the same story with a lot less information on the page? Because the thing that you have to realize when you're talking to a board of directors is they'll never have as much information on your business as you do. They are talking to multiple different companies over any given quarter. And so, and they may not have ever had experience working in digital, working in marketing, working in IT, working in sales. So their experience comes on the financial side. They're very interested in what happens in finance. What you need to do is actually focus on the information that you can communicate to them effectively and not go too deep into the story, not be able to tell the story without all the details. And, for me personally, I'm a detail person. I tend to get wrapped up in the details. So really being able to back off that and tell a story without going too much into the details is absolutely, a goal of mine every time I go in front of the board. And I do try to take that approach. It's like, okay, what are the things that I can take off this page and still tell the story? I would say that's a work in progress, but it's definitely something that I think every marketer should do, is just remember that your audience is not always as interested in what you're talking about as you are.
Yeah, that's true to the board of directors. That's especially true to customers as well, especially with technical products. So I had interviewed the head of marketing at Cuisinart earlier on the How I Made It in Marketing podcast, and she was talking about how, with a lot of housewares products, I have a washing machine. It's got AI in it. I don't know what the AI does in the washing machine, right? Or you get these toasters. It's got all these different functions. You don't know what's going on. And she's like, one, that's harder to communicate to the customer, right? There's a lot of complexity there. But two, especially in an era of supply chain issues, in an era of inflation, everything you're adding when you're making an appliance smart that doesn't need to be smart, you're adding cost to it. And so she was talking about one of the most popular products, the food processor, designed in the 1970s. It's got 3 functions. It's got on, off, and pulse, which is just another version of on. And it's usually popular. And I actually didn't realize we have that food processor, and I've used it before, and I hadn't thought about it. Like, yeah, it is just so intuitively easy to use. Up, down, middle, like that's it. And so I think sometimes you had also mentioned the Steve Jobs quote in your podcast guest application, simple can be harder than complex. Sometimes it's not additive. It's what can we take away? What can we take away? What can we strip till we get to the essence of our value proposition? So that's great. Let's look at we talked about the things that you have made in your career, and that's key to, our life as marketers, but also the people we make them with, the people we collaborate with is so important. And so let's talk about the first person you collaborated with that you learned from. You said Kim Hibbler, the VP of SMB sales at Dell, who's currently retired. You learned from her how to balance an extremely successful career with a really interesting life. And I like that, especially because you had those adjectives too. It wasn't just successful career and interesting life. It's extremely successful career and really interesting life. So tell us about Kim and how you learned that lesson from her.
Yeah. So Kim is someone that I worked with at Dell. And honestly, my interactions with her at work were somewhat limited. We were working obviously from a demand generation perspective, things along those lines, but she wasn't as involved in some of the day-to-day activities. But I happened to run into her one morning at a gym that I belonged to, and she convinced me to join a 5 a.m. class. So I was working out with her at least 3 times a week at 5 o'clock in the morning. And it's amazing what you learn about people at 5 o'clock in the morning. It's truly the time. Maybe it might be when you're most authentically yourself if you're making it to the gym at 5 o'clock, but there's really no artifice there. You're just you, you're kind of there, you're doing something. And some of the things that Kim and I talked about while we were together were, how to manage your career while you have young children, how to manage your career while you have older children. And her kids, her son turned 21 or turned 16, like they're 5 years older-ish than my kids. So it was like she started all these major milestones, turning 16, going to college, graduating from college, getting married, and, kind of how she remained such a critical part of her children's life and how she continues to do so, and how she was able to balance that being friendly with the kids, but also being the parental figure and really understanding what kids needed at various different points in their life has been really inspirational to me. And then, just kind of watching her as her career has evolved. She's retired now, but she went from Dell to a number of other companies where she was progressively, more successful. She told me about when she went to Germany to test drive her BMW, and then they shipped it over here. Those types of things, again, I think those life experiences that can be extremely compelling, and being able to balance that while you're in this incredibly stressful work environment at the same time, it's inspired me all throughout my career, but also in my personal life. And still to this day, whenever I'm back in Austin, we get together and we don't go have a coffee or have a cocktail. We go for like a 5 or 6 mile run around the lake. So, I think kind of bringing in that physical piece of your life and being able to balance exercise with stressful jobs and kids. And, I look at her and I say, this woman has, she's been able to do everything. And I'm sure there's sacrifices she's made along the way, but she certainly has it all together as far as I'm concerned. And I would aspire to be like that.
So you're saying I should do podcast interviews at 5 a.m. Then we'll get better things that they're people's really authentic self.
You will probably get a very different perspective. So maybe that might be a good idea.
Well, the thing I like about the really interesting life part, just one, we're human beings, and I hope that is everyone's goal on a certain level, just as a human. But here is my argument where it helps you as a marketer. We as marketers, a key thing we are is creators, right? So we're really only as good as our ideas and our concepts. And what I've learned in my life is, like, if you're not putting things into that brain, you're not going to get things out. And I'm a big fan of stand-up comedy, and I hear some of these stand-up comedians who, once they become really successful, it becomes a lot harder to be a stand-up comedian because their lived experience has changed, right? If you're, very wealthy and famous, then your experience is a lot different from your audience. And you've probably removed a lot of the idiosyncrasies of life, the inconveniences of life. And that's why you hear so many stand-up comedians joke about, what's going on in an airplane and the peanuts and all this stuff, because they're flying all the time. They're traveling all the time. And as marketers, the more we can live life and live as our customers and audience do, but live life, the better ideas we're going to get. And that's very true for B2C marketers, but even for B2B marketers, for myself, one small example of how I got an idea of our, from my own just personal life is, we saw Emily has a dog actually in the room with her right now while we're recording. And normally that freaks me out. I'm worried the dog will bark. It's been so well behaved so far. Hasn't uttered a peep. I'm very impressed. But, I was on a call with my partner at the time and the dog was barking in the background and we were doing internal communications for IBM, for a group in IBM. And sales enablement and these things. And we got, an idea. Even back then, a lot of people work from home. It was a very geographically distributed setup. And just a little thing we could add to the email newsletter to get people to know each other. We called it Who's Barking in the Background, right? Because everyone had that experience. We didn't have video calls at that time, but, you had the audio calls. And, oh, no, the dog's barking and I got to mute. And so we would have a little feature. We had all information about the product and case studies of sales and all of those other things. We just had that little bit in the newsletter, Who's Barking in the Background, where you got to know someone on a personal level because you got to know their dog. So that's my argument for living a really interesting life in marketing. So, we talked earlier about how you had helped someone really transform the arc of their career at the company and kind of changed how people saw them. This is a great, interesting story about transforming the arc of the career, even if they don't stay at the company. So your lesson is coaching and mentoring can help people grow in their current roles, but also help them plan for their future career, even if it is not with their current place of employment. You learned this from working with Joy Chevalier, program manager at Dell. She was then. Now she's founder and president of the Cook's Nook. So how did you learn this from working with Joy?
So it's interesting because I actually get this a lot from my current company because I believe that, when you start talking to people about what their 5-year goals are or what their plan is, a lot of times people haven't really thought that far ahead or they haven't thought that through or they don't really know where they're going or what they want to do. But if you start asking them, well, what do you see yourself doing or what do you aspire to be? Sometimes you get the very traditional, oh, I want to be in your job, or I want to do something in sales, or, I want to grow to the next level of within my current career trajectory. And that's great. Really important to have people that want to stay in the company and everything else. But occasionally you get someone who is very transparent and says, listen, I don't think I'll be here in 5 years. My goal is to actually go do something for the community, to do something that leverages my skill set, which in Joy's case was, she was trained as a chef and also had a couple of other degrees. She's a very smart woman, but she was working at Dell at the time. And it's she had said, I don't think that I want to be here. So part of what we started talking about was, okay, how do we build up your skill set, finance, outside of marketing specifically, but really think more broadly about things that you would need to run a business. And, she only worked for me for a year or so after that, and then eventually left Dell after I left. But I've been so pleased to kind of watch her grow and develop. We're still friends, and, really see her take on this role as a starting a new company. It's an incubator where they do trying to bring food to less privileged areas of the Austin community, and really thinking about, a whole range of things that I think her experience at Dell, if you were to say, oh, you're a program manager here, and now you're going to be a CEO or a president of a company over here, it may not immediately translate, but when you look at some of the skills that she built in her role and how they translated, it makes a ton of sense. And you're like, yes, you were prepared to go do this totally different career. And, I think that as managers and as leaders, if we're not helping our employees think about their careers and think about what they want and then helping support them, if you look at statistics, it's how many people are staying in their jobs, in their companies, their entire career? Very, very few at this point. So if you can get more out of your employees over the next 3 to 5 years by helping them get to where their ultimate goal is, it's a win-win situation. You're helping them, but they're also really contributing enthusiastically because they know that you have their best interest at heart and they know that you're trying to help them grow in the direction that they want to grow for their career. So, Joy is a single example, but I feel like that's something that I think about a lot of different people in my career, and I've always tried to be very open to what their goals are so that I can help guide and direct them in their career development in a way that actually helps them as opposed to just helping me.
Well, no, it sounds like you really tapped into her passion, which, as you said, helped in those 3 to 5 years or however long she was with you, get the most out of her. So that's great. But, when I've gotten that answer of, oh, I want your role in 5 years or whatever, sometimes I really just gotta, ask and challenge it, because I think there's this real shininess or whatever to managing people, right? To growing in an organization and getting to manage people. And it's just not right for everyone. And so sometimes I would have to challenge people of like, you want to manage people, really? Like, why do you want to manage people? Like, what is it about managing people that makes you want to do it? And so I think it's also just so important within an organization to have different paths to success, right? So if people management is the only path to success, you're probably going to get people with really good subject matter expertise in different areas, and creativity and programming and development and all these different areas that you're forcing into a role that's just not right for them, which is either getting them to not want to stay because they can't find success with the things they do, or is going to end up giving you ineffective managers. So I want to get an idea from you. So when you talk about, you talk to Joy, give us an idea, like, what is the cadence of how you learn about your team, both your direct reports and your reports? I mean, do you have an annual sit down with them? Do you have monthly one-on-ones? And, how do you kind of plot out their career path in that?
Yeah, it kind of depends on the size of the team that I'm managing at the time. And really a lot depends on what the team members are actually looking for. So as an example, you said this at the beginning, I manage a team of about 40 people right now. I've had teams in my past that were much larger, also smaller, so it kind of depends. But, I was in Idaho last week meeting with some of my marketing team. We have an office in Idaho for some reason. And there's differences in the team there, right? So there are some members of the team that are more experienced. They've been in their career a long time. My creative director is there, who does a lot of our web design, and we have basically an in-house agency that does a lot of our catalogs and advertising, things along those lines. So, and I was talking to her about her career and what she's looking for, and then I went and had a very similar discussion with someone on her team, and the differences were stark, right? I mean, you're talking to one person who's in their mid-20s, who's still trying to find where they want to go, who's very eager to learn more, who wants to, experience change and wants to try a broad range of different activities. And then you have someone who's been in a job a long time that you're challenging them to do more, to move to a different type of design cadence and capabilities. And, they both have extremely different needs. And, what I try to take from something like that is, how do I then respond? How can I keep them both motivated, knowing that maybe it's not going to be exactly what they want in the next year, but also look for opportunities where maybe for this person who's at the very beginning of their career or towards the beginning of their career, I can give her challenging assignments or things that are maybe outside of the scope of what might be currently within her job. Just to give her learning experiences. And how can I support the creative director, the manager of the team, so that she's not feeling overwhelmed with all this new stuff that's being thrown at her on a day-to-day basis, and really making sure that she understands, what expectations are and how great of a job she's actually doing. So, I think that you almost have to take it on a one-on-one basis to understand, what does that person need and what can you give them versus maybe what their direct manager needs to give them.
That's great. In your story with Joy, I mean, that got into something in her personal life. And I think something that's happened really in the past few years too, with COVID and people working from home. And now we're kind of like, actually you're in my home and I'm in your home right now, how we're having this conversation. And that's kind of happened a lot during COVID too, is it gets a lot more into the personal. And I wonder, what are your thoughts about where is the line for how deep a manager gets into their employees' personal life when they're mentoring them? Because I interviewed Frank Wheel. He's a founder and CEO of Minter for an earlier episode of the How I Made It in Marketing podcast. And he told me a story when he worked at Havaianas, the flip-flop maker. The CEO was his mentor. And after the CEO met his girlfriend, the CEO said she wasn't right for him. and they broke up the following week. And I thought, wow, it's so great to, have that close and trusting a relationship with a business mentor. But I also thought, well, where's the line between work and personal life? It kind of gets fuzzy for the employee, for the manager. So in your opinion, Emily, where is that line? How deep should a manager get into their employee's personal life when mentoring or, when going through something like COVID?
Yeah. I mean, I think, so first of all, I think that's a little bit of a balancing act, right? Between how comfortable you are as a manager being in people's living rooms and in their offices and whatever, and also how comfortable the team member is. So for me, I've had people that have worked for me or people that I've worked for who are now deep personal friends who I feel like I can call up at any moment in time and they would be supportive, advice or just chatting about what's going on for the weekend. I think that is something that I feel very comfortable with people that have worked for me in the past and people that I've worked for. So, but you're right, with COVID, it really does lead to a whole nother level of intimacy. As you said, you can see my dog, you can see my cool New England home. But I think there's still an opportunity for, as an employee, to kind of retain some privacy and say, like, I'm not comfortable sharing pieces of myself with you. And I can usually tell if they have a Zoom background on. Like if they have a background, I usually assume that there's only so much. Like that's almost like a wall that they're putting up where they don't want me to necessarily see into their personal life. And I try to be very respectful of that. But I do think it's very important, especially in kind of the hybrid working post-COVID world. My whole team is remote. And there are offices around the country, but my team doesn't regularly go into them. I think it is very important to understand that people's personal lives are extremely important. And, you have to have a level of flexibility around dogs barking in the background and, people coming in and delivering lunch. I know the CRO that I work with, his wife comes into the Zoom background constantly and brings him like snacks and delivers him his coffee. And I'm like, what is she doing that she's like always coming in on your calls? But that's how his life works, and he's comfortable with that. So, I think that part of this is being flexible and being prepared to be comfortable sharing to the level that other people are willing to share. I wouldn't advise anybody to break up with their girlfriend, though. That seems like a terrible idea.
I thought it was I thought on the one hand, he still has this relationship with that CEO. She sits on the board of his company now. And what a special and fantastic thing to have that deep of a relationship. But I also thought, in my own life, well, I don't know. How far would I want a mentor to go into my personal life and get into my relationship? So as you said, I think that's a great point. It really varies based on the manager and the employee. And I also think I hadn't really thought of that before, but that's a really great point about, when we were in person, we used to look for these kind of subtle visual cues. We would naturally do this just as human beings of when another person's communicating with you. Are they open? Are they closed? I had never really thought, but now when you said it, it instantly made sense. When someone has that Zoom background up, there's a certain level of privacy they're trying to tell you of like, hey, I'm not too comfortable with you getting involved in my house and my personal life. That's a really great point. All right, the final lesson here, and this is the one I opened the episode up with because I loved it so much. You said, go into a meeting with a high-level story, never the details. I've been in too many meetings where data is presented, and it just seems like data is presented for data's sake without the clarity of why does it really matter? And so you said you learned this lesson from Matt Anderson, the CDO, Chief Data Officer of Arrow Electronics, who is currently at the Carlyle Group. So how did you learn this lesson, and how have you used it in your career? I think we kind of touched on this when you talked about talking to the board of directors.
Yeah. So just for clarification, he was actually the Chief Digital Officer, but he also had responsibility for data as well. So slightly different. Also another D. Yeah, I think that it's interesting. You take a very old school company like Arrow Electronics, which has been around forever. It's about a $27 billion company that most people have never heard of because they are in the electronics distribution space. So unless you're in the industry, you probably have not heard of them or don't work with them. And very, very old school in terms of the approach to how you engage with customers, very much feet on the street type of a strategy. And Matt came into the business and basically threw everything up into the air around driving a more transactional digital business in order to bring a whole new set of customers into the organization. And, again, his ability to kind of storytell and to talk about something completely different and seem like he's rambling and then bring it home to like a point, like the point of a pin where you're like, oh my God, that whole story absolutely makes sense now. I had no idea where you were going with it, but now I completely see how all of those pieces connect. And to me, that kind of storytelling, again, I look at many of the mentors and some of the people that I've spoken about here as like people that I would aspire to be. Just the ability to kind of to tell a story, to bring a group of people, whether it's a large audience that you're speaking to at a conference, a podcast, a board of directors, but to tell a story that is so compelling and so connected that by the end of the story, you feel absolutely convinced that the proposal, the idea is 100% the right thing to do for your business, even if it's completely outside the realm of something you've done in the past. Matt has that skill. I would say he's the type of person who could sell ice to Eskimos, but he's just much better than that even. And being able to watch him, kind of his thought process and how he puts together some of these discussion points, even when he's talking to his own team, he can be extremely inspiring. And again, it's that storytelling piece that really brings you along as someone who works for him or with him or around him. It's just, again, it's very inspiring.
Yeah, I love that because, at Marketing Sherpa, I think we were mentioning this earlier in our conversation, but Marketing Sherpa, we get pitched all the time about all these things. And there's so many people that have opinions, right? But who can really back up that opinion with evidence? One way to do that is with a story, walking people through, okay, here's how I came to understand this. Here's how you can use this. And so just to give one example, looking at your podcast guest application, like I mentioned, get out of your comfort zone. For example, that's a lesson you hear many people say. I'm sure no one listening to the podcast is shocked to hear that. I'm sure they've heard it before. But what makes it so powerful is your story of having a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old and moving to Ireland with Dell and going through all that. That's what makes it powerful. So I think, every marketer should keep that in mind. That's great for your internal meetings with your team, with whoever you have to present to, your board of directors. It's so important for your customers too. You can say these things. It's one thing to say the thing, but then to back it up with a story, especially if that story has real evidence to, show how something actually came to be, it's just so much more powerful. So, and thank you for sharing all of your stories with us today, Emily.
Thank you for having me. This has been great.
Well, one final question I wanted to ask. We kind of went through all these stories. You shared all of these lessons. What are the key qualities of an effective marketer, if you had to just break it down?
Gosh, I think that for me and in my career and my experience, it's almost like a balanced triangle. You have to be able to manage the technology. If you are a creative designer, even, in today's world, even if you're purely on the creative side, you have to be able to leverage technology in order to get your job done. And I think that marketing, you constantly see those market maps of all of the different marketing technologies that are available out there. It's just becoming more and more and more important part of our go-to-market strategy to be able to lean on and leverage technology to be effective. I think you have to understand your data. I mentioned A/B testing as part of this, but again, data goes in so many different directions and there's so much information out there. You have to be able to pick the right elements and be able to use that in what you're building, whether it's a campaign, digital transformation, or an ad for next Tuesday. You have to leverage data in order to do things intelligently. And then finally, I think that creative piece is something that as marketers, we can't lose sight of. We can't be so invested in the technology and the data that we forget that, a very, very compelling creative ad can bring customers along. The storytelling piece, it can bring customers so much further than you can if you just have speeds and feeds or, a very data-driven approach to your marketing activities. If you can bring customers along, they say picture's worth 1,000 words. And if you pick the right thing, you really can leverage that creativity, the power of creative in order to meet your customer needs, in order to address your board, your employees, your managers, your partners in your organization. All of those pieces come together in that element of, creativity. So I think, I would say, balance on that axis between technology, data, and creativity. And, that's, to me, what makes a successful marketer.
Yeah, and it makes it a fun role too. You know what I mean? To be able to take that technical knowledge, that data knowledge, and come up with something creative. I mean, boy, what a fun thing to come into work and do, I think. So,
yeah.
Well, thank you for, again, sharing all your stories, Emily. It was such a joy to talk to you today. We got a barking. We got a barking right at the end.
Right at the end, I was like, "Oh, stop it!"
Hey, it's his way. It's her way of saying, "Hey, I was part of this too. I was here too. I was present."
Yes.
Well, anyway, Emily, thank you so much for joining us today.
Okay, thank you so much.
And thanks for everyone for listening.
Thank you for joining us for How I Made It in Marketing with Daniel Burstein. Now that you've gotten inspiration for transforming yourself as a marketer, get some ideas for your next marketing campaign from Marketing Sherpa's extensive library of free case studies at marketingsherpa.com. That's marketingsherpa.com.